I demand you arrest him immediately. Karen's voice screeched across the morning air as the police cruiser pulled up to the cabin trail. This is HOA property, not someplace for vagrants. I stood there calmly in front of the no trespassing sign she'd illegally erected, holding up a yellow document that nobody seemed to understand. The two officers glanced at each other, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons, thinking they were just handling some petty land dispute between residents and the homeowners association. But Karen had no idea what she'd just done. She'd called the wrong person, and that 911 call had just activated a special protection protocol reserved for people exactly like me. My name is Ezra Blackwood, and I'm a 35-year-old freelance carpenter who'd been living quietly in my family's old cabin for 3 years. The weathered log structure wasn't much to look at, with its rough-hewn walls and tin roof that sang in the rain, but it held more history in its foundation than all the McMansions and Emerald Ridge estates combined. My Cherokee and Scottish heritage ran deep in this land, passed down through generations who'd called this place home since 1897. The woman screaming at the police was Vivian Sterling Hayes, though everyone in the neighborhood just called her Karen behind her back. At 52, she'd perfected the art of using her ex-husband's money and social position to bulldoze anyone who didn't fit her vision of how the world should work. She stood there in her usual uniform of designer athleisure wear and righteous indignation, clutching her phone like a weapon while demanding my immediate arrest for the crime of walking on my own family's ancestral land. What Karen didn't know was that her frantic 911 call had just activated something much bigger than a simple trespassing complaint. The harassment had started 6 months earlier with what seemed like a polite letter from the Emerald Ridge Estates HOA. Dear property owner, it began in that passive-aggressive tone that wealthy suburbanites had perfected. We've received complaints about unauthorized foot traffic on private HOA roads. Please ensure all guests use designated pathways to avoid future issues. I tossed it in the trash, knowing full well that the ancient trail connecting my cabin to the main road had been used by my family for over a century. The trail existed long before their precious gated community was even a developer's wet dream. But Karen Sterling Hayes wasn't the type to take silence as an answer. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one with sharper edges and a $50 fine attached for failure to comply with community standards. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. This was war. I spent the next weekend at the county courthouse, pulling dusty records and cross-referencing property deeds that most people never bothered to examine. What I found made my Cherokee blood run cold. The original surveys from the 1950s showed clear evidence of boundary manipulation, with my family's land mysteriously shrinking on paper while the surrounding development expanded like a cancer. Phone calls to the Cherokee Nation archives in Oklahoma revealed even more disturbing information. My great-grandfather's original deed had been lost in a convenient courthouse fire in 1954, replaced with a much smaller parcel that conveniently excluded the trail access rights. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was criminal. Someone had systematically erased my family's legal claim to land we'd owned for generations, and I was starting to suspect that Karen's family had been involved from the beginning. The third attack came in the form of Karen herself, marching up to my cabin on a Tuesday morning with a clipboard, measuring tape, and the kind of entitled confidence that only comes from never being told no. I'm conducting an official HOA property assessment, she announced, as if she had any legal authority to set foot on my land. This structure appears to be in violation of multiple community architectural standards, and frankly, it's bringing down property values for everyone in the neighborhood. I watched from my porch as she photographed every angle of my home, making notes about unsightly appearances and historically inappropriate modifications. When I politely asked to see her legal authorization for the inspection, she huffed and declared that as HOA president, she had the right to protect community interests. Her arrogance was breathtaking, but I remained calm, knowing that patience would serve me better than the anger bubbling up inside my chest. The fourth escalation involved Karen's brilliant plan to have my water access disconnected. She'd somehow convinced the county utilities department that my cabin was illegally tapping into the community water system, presenting them with official-looking paperwork that I later discovered was completely fabricated. I came home from a carpentry job one Tuesday to find a work crew preparing to cut off my service, their supervisor apologizing but explaining that they had to follow county orders. It took 3 hours of frantic phone calls and a personal visit to the county office to prove that my family had water rights dating back to the original homestead patent. The supervisor was mortified when he realized the mistake, explaining that they'd received documentation claiming my connection was unauthorized. When I asked for copies of the fraudulent paperwork, they mysteriously couldn't be located in their files. Karen's fingerprints were all over this sabotage, but proving it would require more evidence than I currently had. The fifth and most brazen attack came when Karen organized what she called a community safety patrol to monitor my property. Twice a day, groups of HOA members would take their evening walks past my cabin, always stopping to take photos and make loud comments about undesirable elements and security concerns while staring directly at my windows. They'd shine flashlights through my windows after dark, document my comings and goings in a shared notebook, and generally make my life miserable through constant surveillance. When I finally confronted them about the harassment, they smugly claimed they were simply exercising their rights to use public walkways. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were patrolling land that legally belonged to my family, but I knew that pointing this out would only escalate their behavior. It was during this harassment campaign that I made the phone call that would change everything. I contacted the Bureau of Indian Affairs Regional Office in Denver, explaining my situation and providing detailed documentation of my family's Cherokee heritage and our historical connection to the land. The response was swift and professional in a way that surprised me. Within a week, Wesley Chen, a federal representative specializing in Native American land rights, had reviewed my case and confirmed what I'd suspected all along. My property wasn't just protected by state law, it was under federal jurisdiction as part of the Cherokee Nation Trust Territory. The BIA had been tracking similar cases across the Southwest, and my complaint fit perfectly into a pattern of systematic land theft that had been ongoing for decades. What I didn't know yet was that my family's case was about to become the key that unlocked a conspiracy reaching back generations. The morning Karen called 911, I was more than prepared. I'd been carrying the original 1897 deed in my backpack for weeks, along with a small drone to document any confrontations that might arise. As I walked down the familiar trail that my grandfather had shown me as a child, I could feel the weight of history in every step. The worn path beneath my feet had been walked by 4 generations of my family, and every rock and tree root told a story of resilience and survival. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about justice for all the Cherokee families who'd been systematically displaced from their ancestral homes by people exactly like Karen Sterling Hayes. When Karen appeared beside her freshly installed illegal sign, I knew this was the moment of truth. She launched into her usual tirade about property values and community standards, her voice rising to that particular pitch that wealthy suburbanites reserve for people they consider beneath them. "Can't you read?" She snapped, pointing at the sign like it was some kind of divine commandment. "This is private property belonging to Emerald Ridge Estates HOA. You need to turn around and find another way to whatever homeless camp you're heading to." I remained completely silent, letting her dig her own grave with every word. The more she talked, the more evidence I was gathering for what was about to unfold. When she finally pulled out her phone to call the police, I calmly activated my drone and began recording everything. Her panic at being filmed was immediate and telling. "You can't film here!" she screamed, her carefully composed facade cracking like cheap paint. "This is private property." "I'm calling the police right now." The irony of her claiming privacy rights while violating mine wasn't lost on me, but I knew that pointing this out would only make her more hysterical. Instead, I continued recording as she dialed 911 with the kind of urgency most people reserve for actual emergencies. What Karen didn't understand was that her frantic call was about to trigger a federal response system that had been waiting in the background for exactly this kind of situation. Sheriff Morrison arrived within 20 minutes, and I could see the recognition in his weathered eyes as he examined my documentation. This was a 20-year veteran who dealt with federal jurisdiction issues before, and something about the official seals and federal registration numbers on my deed immediately put him on alert. His partner Rodriguez seemed ready to treat this as a routine trespassing call until Morrison caught his eye and gave him a subtle headshake. "Good morning, sir," Morrison said to me with professional courtesy that clearly confused Karen. "Could I take a look at that document you're holding?" I handed over the deed and watched his expression change as he studied the Bureau of Indian Affairs markings and Heritage Protection Registry numbers that most people wouldn't recognize. The real shock came when Wesley Chin's black SUV appeared around the bend in the trail. Karen's face went white as she watched a serious-looking federal agent emerge with a briefcase and official identification displayed prominently on his jacket. "Good morning, everyone," Chin announced with the quiet authority that comes from representing the United States government. "I'm Wesley Chin, federal representative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We received an automated alert about a potential conflict at a designated Heritage Protection Zone." The words Heritage Protection Zone seemed to hit Karen like a physical blow. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air as her entire worldview began crumbling in real time. Chin's explanation was methodical and absolutely devastating to Karen's position. "This location has been flagged in our Heritage Protection database since 2010, he explained, consulting his tablet with clinical precision. "Any incidents involving potential harassment of individuals with sovereign heritage status at protected sites automatically trigger our response protocol." He looked directly at Karen as he continued, "Mrs. Sterling Hayes, your property isn't just subject to local HOA regulations. This land is under federal protection as Cherokee Nation Trust Territory, which means your sign is not only illegal, it's a violation of federal law." The revelation that would completely destroy Karen's world came when Chin delivered the news that changed everything. "Mrs. Sterling Hayes," he said with the kind of calm that precedes a nuclear explosion. "According to our historical records, you're not just dealing with a routine property dispute. You're the granddaughter of Harold Sterling, the federal relocation officer who systematically displaced 12 Cherokee families from this area between 1950 and 1955. The color drained from Karen's face as the implications sank in. Her family's wealth, her comfortable lifestyle, her entire identity had been built on the systematic theft of Cherokee land. The very ground she was standing on had been stolen by her own grandfather, and now his crimes were finally coming home to roost. The emergency HOA meeting that Karen called 2 hours later was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in my 35 years. The Emerald Ridge Estates clubhouse was packed wall to wall, with 200 wealthy suburbanites who'd received urgent text messages about an imminent threat to property values and community security. The panic in their voices was palpable, as neighbors whispered to each other about what this could mean for their investments. What they didn't know was that Wesley Chin and Sheriff Morrison were sitting quietly in the back row with sophisticated recording equipment, documenting every word for what Chin had ominously referred to as federal case evidence. The trap was set, and Karen was about to walk straight into it. Karen had prepared an elaborate PowerPoint presentation, complete with property value charts, legal precedents she'd frantically researched online, and dramatic photos of my modest cabin that she'd taken from drone footage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing through the clubhouse sound system with false confidence, "we are facing an unprecedented attack on our property rights and our American way of life. A man claiming to be Native American is trying to use some old document to take control of our private roads and potentially our entire community." The way she emphasized claiming to be made my Cherokee blood boil, but I remained calm in my seat, knowing that Chin was recording every syllable for the federal prosecutors who would soon be very interested in her words. The crowd's reaction was more mixed than Karen had expected, which clearly threw off her carefully rehearsed performance. While some residents nodded along with her presentation, others were asking uncomfortable questions that she hadn't prepared for. Mrs. Patterson, a 90-year-old woman who'd lived in the area longer than anyone else, stood up with surprising vigor and called out, "Karen, does this man have legal documentation to support his claims? Because I remember there being a Cherokee family near that cabin when I first moved here in 1960. They always said that land belonged to them, and they seemed like honest folks." Karen's face flushed red as she struggled to maintain control of the narrative she'd worked so hard to construct. "The specifics of his documentation don't matter," she replied with growing desperation. "What matters is protecting our investment and our children's future from people who want to take advantage of political correctness." That's when Wesley Chin decided to make his presence known to the entire room. He stood up from his inconspicuous seat in the back row, his federal badge catching the overhead lights as he moved with deliberate purpose toward the front of the room. "Excuse me, Mrs. Sterling Hayes," he said. his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent clubhouse. But I think your residents deserve to hear the complete picture before making any decisions that might have serious legal consequences for everyone involved. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as 200 people suddenly realized they had a federal agent in their midst. You could hear a pin drop as Chen continued his approach to the podium, his every step echoing like a countdown to Karen's doom. Karen's composure cracked completely as Chen reached the front of the room. "You can't be here," she stammered, her voice losing all its previous authority. "This is a private HOA meeting for residents only, and you have no jurisdiction in our community affairs." Chen smiled politely as he reached into his briefcase and pulled out an official document with federal seals. "Mrs. Sterling Hayes, when a private organization holds meetings to discuss potential violations of federal law, those meetings can become subject to federal oversight under the Heritage Protection Act. I'm here to ensure that your residents receive accurate information about their legal situation before they make any decisions they might regret." The next 20 minutes were like watching a controlled demolition. Chen calmly explained to the packed clubhouse that their entire development sat on land with disputed federal protections, that the original county approvals may have been issued without proper acknowledgement of Native American rights, and that the HOA's attempt to block access to trust land could result in serious federal penalties for every homeowner in the community. He spoke with the measured authority of someone who delivered this same devastating news to other communities, and I watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in among the residents. Phone calls to lawyers were already being made, property values were being mentally recalculated, and Karen's leadership was being questioned in whispered conversations throughout the room. The most dramatic moment came when Chen revealed the historical documents that Aurora Redfeather, a Cherokee elder, had driven from Oklahoma to present as evidence. The photographs were damning in their clarity, showing Cherokee families being forced from their homes in the 1950s, government officials overseeing systematic displacement, and children crying as they were loaded onto trucks. In the center of several images was a stern-faced white man in a government uniform, his hand resting authoritatively on official documents. "That's Harold Sterling, Federal Relocation Officer, Aurora," announced in a voice that carried the weight of generational pain. Karen's grandfather. The gasps from the audience were audible as they realized they were looking at the architect of the very system that had stolen the land their homes were built on. The revelation that Karen's grandfather had been the mastermind behind the systematic displacement sent shockwaves through the room that I could feel in my bones. Karen stared at the photographs in horror, her face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally, crushing realization. Aurora's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Harold Sterling didn't just relocate Cherokee families. He worked with county officials to ensure that our land claims would never be properly recorded in public documents. He created a deliberate paper trail designed to make Native American ownership appear non-existent." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, and Karen was finally understanding that she'd been married to a man who'd spent decades perpetuating her grandfather's crimes. When her phone rang at that exact moment, displaying Judge Franklin Hayes' name, the timing couldn't have been more perfect for federal investigators. 6 months later, I stood on the exact same spot where Karen had tried to block my access to the ancestral trail, but the world around me had been transformed beyond recognition. The illegal sign that had started this entire confrontation was gone, replaced by a beautiful hand-carved wooden marker that read Cherokee Heritage Trail, a path of reconciliation. Karen herself had commissioned the sign as part of what had become the most comprehensive land rights settlement in federal history, and seeing it there every morning reminded me that sometimes justice comes in ways you never expect. The trail that had once been a source of conflict now served as a symbol of healing, drawing visitors from across the country who came to learn about the real history of this land and the importance of protecting indigenous rights. The congressional inquiry that followed Karen's dramatic confession had indeed uncovered systematic corruption affecting 43 Cherokee families across 3 counties, with tentacles reaching into county governments, federal agencies, and judicial systems that had been compromised for decades. Judge Franklin Hayes was now serving a 15-year federal sentence for civil rights violations, conspiracy to defraud Native American communities, and obstruction of justice. His desperate phone call to Karen during the clubhouse meeting, where he'd essentially confessed to his crimes while being recorded by federal agents, had sealed his fate and provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to unravel the entire conspiracy. Additional arrests had followed, including county officials, developers, and other judges who had participated in the systematic suppression of Cherokee land claims. What surprised everyone, including myself, was how completely Karen had transformed after learning the truth about her family's legacy. After her initial shock and devastation, she'd become one of the most effective advocates for Cherokee land rights restoration that Aurora Red Feather had ever witnessed. Karen's detailed testimony about Judge Hayes' methods, her family's historical documents, and her insider knowledge of how the system worked had provided federal investigators with the roadmap they needed to identify and prosecute dozens of other cases. More importantly, her willingness to publicly acknowledge her grandfather's crimes and take responsibility for her family's role in the displacement had opened a door to healing that many thought would never be possible. The Heritage Community Partnership that we'd established had become a national model for resolving indigenous land disputes without destroying the lives of current residents who had unknowingly bought homes on stolen land. Rather than displacing the 200 families in Emerald Ridge estates, we'd created an innovative shared governance structure that honored both Cherokee sovereignty and the legitimate interests of homeowners who had acted in good faith. The HOA members now paid annual land use fees that went directly into Cherokee cultural preservation programs, educational initiatives, and college scholarships for Native American students. The entire community had committed to learning about and protecting the indigenous history of their neighborhood, turning what could have been a bitter legal battle into a celebration of cultural reconciliation. Karen had surprised everyone by not just accepting this arrangement, but by becoming its most passionate champion. She'd used her organizational skills, social connections, and family wealth to transform the community from a symbol of displacement into a beacon of restorative justice. The Harold Sterling Memorial Fund that she'd established had purchased thousands of acres of land for Cherokee cultural preservation, funded legal challenges to other cases of systematic land theft, and provided resources for families seeking to reclaim their ancestral properties. "I can't undo what my grandfather did," she told a national television audience, "but I can spend the rest of my life making sure it never happens again to another family." The transformation in our personal relationship had been perhaps the most unexpected development of all. Where once Karen had seen me as a threat to her comfortable suburban existence, she now understood that I represented the continuity of a people who'd survived generations of attempts to erase them from this land. We developed what could only be described as an unlikely friendship, built on her genuine remorse and my family's traditional values of forgiveness rather than revenge. My grandfather had always taught me that hatred was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than its intended target, and I'd chosen to honor that wisdom even in the face of Karen's initial cruelty. The healing that resulted had been more powerful than any legal victory could have been. The legal implications of my federal guardian status had been as far-reaching as the investigators had predicted. Federal courts had ruled that the Cherokee Nation had legitimate claims to nearly 12,000 acres of developed land across the Southwest, all of it originally stolen through the same systematic fraud that Harold Sterling had pioneered in the 1950s. But instead of mass displacement and legal chaos, the Heritage Community Partnership model was being replicated across the region, creating a new framework for addressing historical injustices without punishing innocent current residents. Legal scholars were calling it the most significant advancement in Native American land rights since the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. As I prepared for that morning's guided tour, which had become a weekly tradition drawing visitors from around the world, I reflected on how much had changed since that first confrontation. The trail now served hundreds of visitors each month, people who came to learn about Cherokee history and witness firsthand how historical wounds could be healed through acknowledgement, accountability, and genuine reconciliation. Karen often served as a tour guide herself, sharing the painful but necessary story of her family's role in the displacement, while emphasizing the possibility of redemption through honest action and sustained commitment to justice. The most satisfying moment came when I watched another well-dressed suburban woman step out of an expensive SUV, pointing aggressively at a Cherokee fisherman who was legally accessing the nearby stream for traditional fishing rights. She pulled out her phone to call the police, but the dispatcher's response stopped her cold. "Ma'am, before I dispatch officers, I need to verify whether this location has heritage protection status. Can you provide the exact coordinates? The woman's aggressive posture deflated immediately as she realized that the system had changed, that her automatic assumption of authority over indigenous people was no longer going to be supported by law enforcement. Karen appeared beside me, having witnessed the same scene, and said with deep satisfaction, "The heritage protection protocol is working exactly as it should." That woman just learned what I had to learn the hard way. That privilege doesn't automatically override justice. The land my grandfather had told me to protect was finally truly protected, not just by federal law, but by a community that had learned to value truth over convenience, justice over comfort, and healing over hatred.